In a quiet, aging town where the rhythms of life had slowed to a gentle and predictable cadence, the post office had stood as a steadfast sentinel for more than a century, its brick facade weathered by generations of rain and sun, and within its walls, Samuel Reed worked as the last remaining full-time postal clerk, a man dedicated to the almost extinct art of sorting letters by hand long after efficient, humming machines had taken over the task everywhere else, because he harbored a deep and quiet belief that handwritten messages carried within their folded pages something uniquely fragile and human that technology, for all its speed, often missed entirely: the palpable weight of intention, the subtle tremor of emotion in the pen strokes, the quiet hope sealed inside an envelope. Every morning, in the deep blue hush before dawn, he would unlock the post office's heavy wooden doors, brew a pot of weak, bitter coffee that perfumed the air with nostalgia, and handle each envelope that passed across his worn sorting table as carefully as if it were a cherished photograph, feeling the texture of the paper, noting the choice of stamp, and wondering about the story contained within. One particularly cold winter evening, while methodically clearing out a forgotten, cobwebbed storage room scheduled for demolition and renovation, Samuel's flashlight beam fell upon a small, tarnished metal box tucked behind a fallen shelf, covered in a thick blanket of dust and speckled with rust, and upon prying open its stubborn lid, he found it filled to the brim with letters of various sizes and styles, all of them bearing the faded cancellation mark of the same date from nearly 15 years earlier, a silent archive of messages that had never reached their intended destinations, forgotten by time and the systems meant to deliver them. Overcome by a sense of solemn duty mixed with profound curiosity, Samuel carefully lifted the bundle of letters and, sitting on an upturned crate in the dusty gloom, began to read the return addresses, his heart sinking as he realized most of the senders, and likely the intended recipients, had long since moved away or passed on, their connections to this place severed. One letter, however, stood out immediately, addressed in a precise, elegant script to Emily Carter, a name Samuel recognized with a jolt of memory. Emily had been a beloved schoolteacher at the town's elementary school, remembered as kind but increasingly distant and sorrowful, who had left town abruptly and without explanation years ago, not long after her fiancé had tragically died in a sudden accident. This letter's stamp was perfectly intact, its envelope crisp and unopened, a sealed vault containing words from a past that had been abruptly cut short. Samuel hesitated, knowing the official protocol dictated he should process them as undeliverable dead mail, but something in the careful, loving curvature of the handwriting, in the very weight of the paper in his hand, whispered that this particular letter had waited in darkness long enough and deserved, against all odds, to complete its long-interrupted journey. He spent the next days conducting quiet research, piecing together fragments of information from old directories and hesitant conversations with long-time residents, until he located a current address for Emily in a distant coastal city, and with a carefully composed note of explanation for the incredible delay, he placed the original, aged envelope inside a new, protective one and sent it on its way, this time with a prayer for its safe passage. Weeks of silence passed, during which Samuel found himself glancing more frequently at the post office door, until finally a reply arrived, written on delicate stationery that carried the scent of sea salt. Emily's response was one of trembling, raw honesty, detailing how the letter had been from her lost fiancé, written in the deep stillness of the night before his death, a message that apologized tenderly for a foolish argument they had never resolved and expressed with heartbreaking clarity the future he believed with all his heart they still had time to build together, a future she had been denied not only by his death, but by the crushing absence of these very words, leaving her to live for 15 long years shrouded in a grief hardened by the assumption that his final thoughts of her had been ones of anger or disappointment, that he had left this world without offering or receiving forgiveness. Moved by this revelation and the closure it offered, Emily returned to the town soon after, and she and Samuel walked the quiet, familiar streets under a pale winter sun as she spoke, her voice soft but steady, about the peculiar nature of a grief that hardens and becomes a permanent part of one's architecture when essential words go missing. "I thought the silence he left behind was the truth," she told Samuel, her eyes reflecting the bare trees. "Now I know it was only an absence, a void that this letter has finally filled." Before boarding the train to return to her coastal life, Emily placed a new letter into Samuel's hands, this one addressed to no one in particular, and inside, in her own graceful script, she had written, "Some messages arrive late, but they still arrive exactly when we are finally ready to understand them. With a renewed sense of purpose that settled deep into his bones, Samuel carefully returned the remaining contents of the metal box to their storage, sealing the container this time not with a sense of forgotten futility, but with a profound and quiet respect for the power of connection that can sleep for years, waiting for its moment. The town around him continued its steady forward motion, its residents largely unaware that one small, delayed letter had quietly, irrevocably rewritten the entire emotional history of a life, mending a fracture 15 years old, and in doing so, had reminded one solitary man in a fading post office why every single message, no matter how old or seemingly insignificant, still deserved, with all the patience and care he could muster, to be carried faithfully from sender to receiver, as a sacred testament to the human need to be heard and understood.